A billionaire was on his way to a life-changing business deal when suddenly, boom! His car broke down in the middle of a storm. Stranded with no phone signal, he thought all hope was lost. But then, out of nowhere, 3 teenage boys appeared. What happened next will shock you. Watch until the end to see how one simple act of kindness changed everything. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. Where are you watching from? The sky was an endless stretch of dark, brooding clouds, their weight pressing down on the highway as sheets of rain poured relentlessly onto the asphalt. Chris Hunt's grip on the steering wheel tightened as his black Mercedes cut through the storm, windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the onslaught of water. The rhythmic hum of the car's engine was the only sound inside the luxurious cabin, but outside, the world raged. He stole a glance at the glowing numbers on his dashboard, 35 minutes until the meeting. His jaw clenched. He couldn't afford a delay. Not today. Not when this deal was on the line. It wasn't just any contract. This was a billion-dollar merger that could solidify his legacy, a move that would keep his competitors scrambling for years to come. A sudden boom shattered his focus. The car jerked violently to the right, the unmistakable thud, thud, thud of a flat tire sending vibrations up through the wheel. His heart pounded as he struggled to control the vehicle, forcing it toward the shoulder of the deserted highway. The rain pounded against the car roof like a war drum, the storm swallowing his curses as he threw the gear into park. He ran a hand through his short, slicked-back hair and exhaled sharply. This could not be happening. Pulling on his coat, he pushed open the door and stepped into the downpour, immediately assaulted by the cold, stinging rain. The moment his Italian leather shoes hit the wet ground, mud splashed up his pant legs. He looked down at the mess and scowled before shifting his attention to the tire. Completely blown. Shredded rubber clung uselessly to the wheel, and with no shelter nearby, he had no choice but to handle this in the open storm. His fingers instinctively reached for his pocket, pulling out his phone. No signal. Of course. Chris inhaled deeply, forcing himself to think. He could change the tire himself. No, that wasn't an option. He hadn't changed a tire in his life. That was what employees were for, what assistance and roadside services existed for. But out here, on this empty stretch of road, none of that mattered. He was alone. The storm and the ticking clock were his only company. A distant laughter cut through the rain. Chris snapped his head up, squinting through the storm. 3 figures approached on bicycles, their wheels cutting through the flooded pavement with ease. As they drew closer, he made out 3 teenage boys, their raincoats soaked through, their sneakers splattered with mud. They looked about 15 or 16, their dark faces lit with casual amusement as they rode toward him. One of them, taller than the others, pulled up first, resting a foot on the ground. His curly hair was flattened by the rain, but his sharp eyes studied Chris with mild curiosity. "Need some help, sir?" the boy asked, his voice carrying over the storm. Chris hesitated. He wasn't in the habit of accepting help from strangers, especially not from kids. His instincts screamed at him to decline, to wave them off and figure it out himself. But he had no other choice. "I've got a flat," Chris admitted, nodding toward the ruined tire, "and no signal." The boy smirked, clearly unbothered by the situation. "That's rough," he said, glancing at his friends. "You got a spare?" "In the trunk," Chris replied, stepping aside. The tallest boy, who seemed to be the leader, glanced at his 2 friends. "All right, let's get to it." Without another word, they moved as a team, each taking on a role as if this were second nature to them. The second boy, Shorter, with quick hands, jogged to the trunk and pulled out the spare tire along with the jack and wrench. The third, a little stockier, positioned himself near the car to stabilize it. The leader knelt by the flat, fingers already working at the lug nuts. Chris watched in stunned silence. They worked quickly, efficiently, laughing and cracking jokes as if this was just another rainy day. It should have been miserable, covered in rain and mud, but they didn't seem to care. "You do this often?" Chris finally asked, unable to hide his curiosity. The leader, tightening the jack, shot him a grin. "More than you'd think. Mostly on bikes, though." Chris didn't know what to say. He had never met anyone who did something for nothing. In his world, everything was a transaction, a deal, an exchange. Yet, these kids were fixing his tire in the middle of a storm without hesitation, without complaint. 15 minutes later, the job was done. "Good as new," the leader said, brushing his muddy hands off on his raincoat. "You're good to go." Chris stared at the tire, then at the boys, a strange sense of disbelief settling over him. They actually did it. He reached into his wallet, pulling out a thick stack of crisp bills. "Here," he said, extending the money toward them. "You've earned it." The boy shook his head, stepping back. "No need, mister." Chris frowned. "Come on, take it. It's the least I can do." The second boy, Tony, grinned. "We were just passing by. Thought we'd help." Chris felt a flicker of frustration. No one turned down free money. No one. "You sure?" he pressed. The leader smiled, adjusting his rain-soaked hood. "We're sure. Just drive safe, all right?" And just like that, they were gone. Hopping back onto their bikes, pedaling off into the storm, their laughter disappearing into the distance. Chris stood there for a long moment, the cash still in his hand, staring at the empty road where they had vanished. Something about the whole interaction felt off. Not in a bad way, but in a way he couldn't quite grasp. Who does something for nothing? It gnawed at him as he climbed back into his car, his suit soaked through, his hands gripping the wheel. The dashboard clock still gave him enough time to make the meeting. But as he drove off, he realized something strange. For the first time in years, his mind wasn't occupied by business, numbers, or deals. Instead, he was thinking about three boys on bikes, their muddy raincoats, their laughter in the storm. And for some reason, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something important. The meeting went exactly as planned. Chris walked into the towering glass building, his suit still slightly damp from the earlier rain, though he had done his best to brush away the evidence of the miserable afternoon. His assistant had been waiting at the entrance, a concerned look flashing across her face before she quickly adjusted his tie and ushered him inside. The boardroom was filled with the familiar sounds of shuffling papers, low murmurs of conversation, and the steady hum of artificial lighting. Chris took his seat at the head of the long mahogany table, regaining his usual composure, slipping back into the role of the powerful, untouchable businessman. The clients sat opposite him, sharp-eyed and calculating, men who knew the weight of every dollar, every decision. This was his world, a place where precision and control reigned supreme. And yet, as he launched into his presentation, he found his focus strangely fragmented. He spoke with practiced authority, outlining figures, projections, and strategic advantages, his voice unwavering. But somewhere in the back of his mind, the image of the three boys kept intruding, cutting through the numbers, disrupting the rhythm of his well-rehearsed pitch. The sound of their laughter echoed faintly in his memory, the way they had worked in perfect sync, the way they had refused his money without hesitation. It was ridiculous. There was no logical reason for them to still be on his mind. He forced himself to concentrate, tightening his grip on the table's polished edge. The meeting concluded with handshakes and signatures, the deal sealed with an air of finality that should have been satisfying. This was a billion-dollar merger, a move that would secure his dominance in the market, a triumph that any businessman in his position would celebrate. And yet, as the investors congratulated him, as his colleagues whispered excited remarks about their inevitable success, Chris felt none of the usual exhilaration. The thrill of victory, the rush of accomplishment, all of it felt strangely muted. Later that evening, he sat at a high-end restaurant surrounded by colleagues and potential partners, the clinking of glasses and low murmurs of discussion filling the space. The air was rich with the scent of fine wine and expensive dishes, a setting he had long associated with success. He listened to the conversations around him, nodding at the right moments, offering brief remarks where necessary, but his mind was elsewhere. The memory of those boys lingered, persistent, invasive. He couldn't understand it. He replayed the moment they had turned down his money, their casual dismissal of something most people would have grabbed without hesitation. In his world, everything had a price. Every favor, every interaction, every ounce of effort was tied to an expectation of return. But they had helped him without asking for anything in return. That kind of generosity didn't fit into the structure of the world he knew. It gnawed at him an unresolved equation, a gap in his understanding. That night, sleep eluded him. He lay in his king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling, the distant hum of the city barely reaching his penthouse windows. He told himself to forget it, to move on. They were just kids, just a minor blip in an otherwise routine day. But the thoughts refused to leave. He turned onto his side, then onto his back, but no position brought comfort. Frustration built in his chest, a restless agitation that he couldn't shake. By dawn, he had made a decision. He showered, dressed, and grabbed his keys before his assistant even arrived. He ignored the meetings on his schedule, ignored the emails piling up on his phone. His driver offered to take him wherever he needed, but Chris waved him off. He wanted to drive himself. He wasn't sure why, but something about this felt personal. The highway stretched ahead of him, the rain from the previous night leaving the pavement slick and reflective. The storm had passed, but the sky was still heavy with lingering clouds. As he drove, the memory of the boys grew sharper, more insistent. He wasn't even sure what he expected to find when he got there. Maybe he just wanted to understand. He pulled into the small town just before noon. It was quiet, the kind of place where people moved at a slower pace, where faces were familiar, where the air felt less suffocating than the steel and glass towers he was used to. He parked near a modest-looking diner, scanning the street. Then he saw them. The three boys were sitting outside the diner, their bikes leaned against the wall, their faces lit with easy laughter as they talked among themselves. They looked completely unbothered, as if yesterday's encounter had meant nothing to them. Chris hesitated for a moment before stepping out of the car. He adjusted his jacket, suddenly aware of how out of place he must look here. Ethan, the tall one, noticed him first. His eyebrows lifted slightly in recognition before he nudged his friends. "Well, well," Ethan said, leaning back on the bench. "Look who's back. What happened, mister? Another flat tire?" Chris smirked, shaking his head as he approached. "No, this time I'm here for a different reason." Tony tilted his head, curious. Chris sat down across from them, studying their faces. They weren't guarded, weren't wary of him. They simply waited, open and unbothered, as if nothing in the world could shake them. He took a breath. "I wanted to ask you something," he said. "If you could have something, Anything that would actually make a difference for you, what would it be? The boys exchanged glances, and for the first time they seemed slightly caught off guard. Well, Ethan said slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. That's kind of a big question. Chris nodded. Take your time. Tony shrugged. I mean, we don't really need anything. We're good. But Peter, who had been quiet up until now, shifted slightly in his seat. There is one thing, he said, his voice more thoughtful. Ethan and Tony turned to him. Peter glanced at Chris. The community center. It's fallen apart. Roof leaks when it rains. Half the gym equipment is broken and they've been trying to raise money to fix it up. But it's been slow. Chris listened carefully. It's where a lot of kids go after school, Ethan added. Some of them don't really have anywhere else to be. Tony nodded. If you really want to do something, maybe help them instead of us. Chris leaned back, considering their words. He had expected them to ask for something small, something personal, but they had immediately thought about their community, about something bigger than themselves. He felt a strange sense of admiration creep in. A community center, huh? He said finally. That sounds like something worth helping with. Ethan's eyes brightened, though he tried to keep his excitement in check. You're serious? Chris smiled. Yeah, I think I am. A grin spread across Peter's face, and Tony let out a low whistle. Ethan just shook his head with a chuckle. Well, Ethan said, guess you're not as bad as you look, mister. Chris laughed, shaking his head. You might change your mind once you see what I have planned. The boys exchanged eager glances, and for the first time in a long while, Chris felt something shift inside him. He had come here looking for answers, but instead he had found a reason. And somehow, that felt like a better deal than any he had ever made. Chris didn't waste time. The moment he returned to his office, he set everything else aside. The meetings, the calls, the endless flood of business proposals waiting for his approval. None of it seemed to matter as much as it had before. His assistant noticed the shift almost immediately. She knocked on his door, a stack of neatly organized reports in her arms, hesitating as she studied his unusually focused expression. He was sifting through papers, researching local contractors, pulling up financial statements on the town's community center as if it were a new business venture. Sir, your 2:00 with the shareholders. Cancel it, Chris said without looking up. His assistant blinked. Sir? I said, cancel it, he repeated, his fingers still moving across his keyboard, and reschedule the weekly reports. I'll deal with them later. The hesitation in her posture was clear. Chris never canceled meetings, not unless it was an emergency, but something in his tone told her this was not up for discussion. Chris didn't know what had compelled him to move so quickly, but the moment he had left that small town, something in him had shifted. The conversation with those boys, their immediate concern for their community rather than themselves, it lingered, refusing to be pushed aside like just another passing interaction. He had spent his entire life making deals that benefited himself, closing contracts that served his empire. But this wasn't business, this was something else entirely. By the end of the day, he had what he needed. The financials of the community center were exactly what he expected. A mess. The city had provided minimal funding, and while there had been attempts at fundraising, they had barely scratched the surface of what was actually needed. Roof repairs alone would cost thousands, and that wasn't even accounting for the structural damages, the outdated plumbing, the broken-down gym equipment. The place was falling apart. He could fix it. The realization came to him as simply as a passing thought, but it settled deep within him, growing stronger by the second. He had the resources. He had the connections. If those kids were willing to spend their time and energy worrying about the future of their town, then the least he could do was make sure they had a place worth being proud of. The next morning, Chris drove back to the small town. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft glow over the buildings, their edges still damp from the previous night's storm. He pulled up near the community center, stepping out of his car and taking a slow look around. From the outside, it was easy to see the wear and tear. The paint on the walls had faded. Cracks lined the pavement leading up to the entrance, and one of the windows was boarded up with plywood. He had seen enough neglected buildings and struggling neighborhoods to know exactly what this meant. No funding, no priority. No one with enough power to force change. He didn't bother knocking. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust. A few mismatched chairs were scattered near the front desk. A faded bulletin board covered in event flyers that looked like they hadn't been updated in months. He walked further in, his footsteps echoing lightly against the tiled floor. It didn't take long for someone to notice him. A woman in her late 40s stepped out from a small office, a stack of paperwork tucked under her arm. She was dressed in a simple sweater and jeans, her brown hair tied back in a practical ponytail. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw him. He wasn't exactly the kind of person who usually walked into places like this unannounced. "Can I help you?" she asked, shifting the papers in her hands. Chris extended a hand. "Chris Hunt. I wanted to talk to you about this place." She hesitated for a second before shaking his hand, her grip firm. "Karen Bennett," she introduced herself. "I'm the director here." Chris nodded, glancing around the room again. "I spoke to some of the kids in town. They told me this place needs work." Karen let out a dry laugh, rubbing the back of her neck. "That's an understatement." "Then let's talk about fixing it," Chris said simply. For a moment, Karen just stared at him. It was clear she wasn't used to people walking in and offering solutions, least of all someone who looked as out of place as he did. "You're serious?" she asked. "Completely." She studied him for another second before nodding, motioning for him to follow her. They walked through the building together, passing by rooms filled with worn-out furniture, a gym with cracked floors, a storage space packed with broken sports equipment. The more Chris saw, the more he understood why those boys had spoken about this place with such concern. It was more than just a building to them. It was a part of their lives, their community. By the time they circled back to the front, Karen crossed her arms, giving him a careful look. "This place means a lot to the kids," she said, "but renovations like this don't come cheap." Chris met her gaze without hesitation. "I'll cover it." Karen blinked, clearly thrown by the bluntness of his response. "Just like that?" "Just like that," he confirmed. "I have the resources to make this happen. I don't need investors. I don't need approval from a board. I can start this immediately." She exhaled, shaking her head in disbelief. "I don't understand. Why are you doing this?" Chris paused. He could have given a number of answers. He could have said it was a tax write-off. He could have framed it as a charitable endeavor, something to boost his public image. But none of that was the truth. "I guess you could say I owe someone a favor," he finally said. Karen studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right," she said, "let's do this." Chris spent the rest of the afternoon making calls. He reached out to contractors, suppliers, and local businesses that could help with the restoration. He had spent years building relationships in the industry, and it wasn't difficult to get people on board. Money talked. Connections made things happen. And for once, he was using both for something that didn't just benefit himself. By the time the sun began to set, Chris stood outside the community center, watching as a few workers arrived to begin their initial assessments. A familiar voice called out from behind him, "Didn't think you'd actually follow through, mister." Chris turned to see Ethan, Tony, and Peter standing by their bikes, watching him with curiosity. "You should know by now," Chris said, smirking slightly. "I don't make empty promises." Tony whistled, glancing at the workers unloading equipment. "Man, you really went all in." Chris shrugged. "If you're going to do something, might as well do it right." Peter grinned. "Guess we should help then." Chris raised an eyebrow. "You three know anything about construction?" Ethan crossed his arms, smirking. "No, but we know how to get things done." Chris chuckled, shaking his head. "All right then, looks like you're hired." The boys exchanged eager glances, and Chris found himself smiling. For the first time in years, he felt like he was working toward something real, something that actually mattered. And he had a feeling this was only the beginning. Chris had handled hundreds of projects in his career, orchestrating multi-billion-dollar deals that spanned continents. He had directed construction on skyscrapers, overseen corporate acquisitions that restructured entire industries, and dictated financial shifts that determined the course of entire economies. But standing in front of the battered, aging community center, watching the first group of workers unload supplies from their trucks, he realized something unsettling. This wasn't like anything he had done before. There were no shareholders to appease, no profit margins to calculate, no ulterior motives. He wasn't doing this for leverage, wasn't angling for some hidden benefit. For the first time in his life, he was doing something simply because it needed to be done. And it felt strangely, unexpectedly right. The renovations started immediately. Contractors assessed the foundation, noting the cracks in the structure that had gone ignored for years. Roofers began inspecting the water damage that had left entire sections of the building unsafe. Electricians tested the outdated wiring, shaking their heads at how close this place had come to becoming a fire hazard. Every professional that stepped onto the site confirmed what Chris already knew. This wasn't just a minor repair job. The community center was barely holding itself together. It needed a complete overhaul. That didn't change anything for him. It only strengthened his resolve. Ethan, Tony, and Peter arrived every day after school, dropping their bikes near the entrance and making their way onto the construction site as if they had been a part of the crew from the beginning. At first, the workers treated them with amusement, letting them carry small tools or fetch supplies from the trucks, but soon they proved their worth. Tony, always quick with his hands, learned how to handle basic repairs under the guidance of the contractors. Peter, naturally strong, helped move equipment, hauling wooden planks and bags of cement like he had been doing it for years. Ethan, observant and curious, watched everything closely, asking the electricians about the wiring, questioning the roofers about their process, soaking up knowledge like a sponge. Chris observed them from a distance, his usual detachment slowly unraveling. They weren't just kids helping out. They were taking ownership of this project, treating it like it was their own. It was humbling to watch. They had no stake in this beyond their love for their town, their desire to create something better. And yet, they put in the effort as if they were building their own future. Karen worked alongside them, coordinating logistics with an efficiency that impressed even Chris. She had spent years stretching the center's limited budget as far as possible, doing her best to keep things running despite the financial strain. Now, with the funding no longer an issue, she threw herself into the project with relentless energy. She outlined plans for new programs, contacted volunteers, and ensured that everything was running smoothly. One afternoon, as Chris reviewed the blueprints for the building's expansion, Ethan approached him, wiping sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his shirt. "You know, mister, for a billionaire, you don't just stand around giving orders, you actually work." Chris smirked, setting the blueprints aside. "That surprise you?" Ethan shrugged. "A little. Thought guys like you just sat in offices all day making money." Chris leaned against the makeshift desk they had set up in one of the few usable rooms. "I do a lot of that," he admitted, "but this is different." Ethan studied him for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, it is." Chris didn't ask what the boy meant, but he felt the weight of his words. It was different. This wasn't a transaction. There was no expectation of return. It was the first time in years that he was doing something purely for the sake of it. And the strangest part? He didn't miss the old way of doing things. Days passed, and the changes became more visible. The broken-down exterior was reinforced, giving the building a new sense of strength. The gym, once filled with rusted equipment and cracked floors, was completely restored, new machines replacing the old, fresh paint covering years of neglect. The roof was fixed, the classrooms were repainted, and new furniture was brought in, replacing the mismatched, splintered chairs and tables that had served for far too long. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an amber glow over the nearly finished center, Chris stood beside Karen, watching as the last of the workers packed up for the day. The place was unrecognizable. Where once there had been decay and disrepair, there was now life, color, and the promise of something lasting. Karen exhaled, crossing her arms as she took in the sight. "I don't even know how to thank you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. Chris shook his head. "You don't have to." She turned to him, studying his expression. "You've done more than just fix a building, you know. You've given these kids something they can believe in." Chris looked at her, then back at the center. The laughter of children filled the air as some of the younger ones ran around, testing out the new playground equipment that had just been installed. He saw Ethan, Tony, and Peter standing near the entrance, their faces filled with a mix of pride and disbelief. "I think they gave me something too," he admitted. Karen smiled knowingly. "Yeah, I can see that." As the evening settled in, Chris walked toward the boys, who were still admiring the center as if they couldn't quite believe it was real. Peter turned to him first. "So, this is really happening, huh?" Chris nodded. "It's happening." Tony chuckled, shaking his head. "Never thought we'd see it." Ethan smirked. "Guess we gotta start thinking about what's next." Chris raised an eyebrow. "Next?" Ethan crossed his arms. "Yeah, we've still got the old basketball courts down by the park. Those could use some work." Chris laughed, shaking his head. "You guys don't quit, do you?" Peter grinned. "Nope." Chris looked at them at the center, at the town he had once driven through without a second thought, and for the first time in a long time, he realized he didn't want to leave. The work wasn't done. Not yet. And maybe, for the first time in his life, he wasn't in a hurry to move on. The grand opening of the community center was set for Saturday afternoon. The town had never seen an event quite like it. The word had spread fast. Parents, kids, volunteers, even people who had never stepped foot in the center before, wanted to see what had become of the old building. The excitement was palpable. It was no longer just a renovation project, it was a symbol a sign that things could change, that people cared, that even the places long forgotten by the world could be brought back to life. Chris arrived early that morning, standing outside the freshly painted walls, watching as final touches were put in place. The playground glistened with new slides and swings. The basketball court had been resurfaced, and the once dilapidated classrooms were now bright and welcoming. Volunteers were setting up tables, arranging food, stacking boxes of donated supplies. Everything was coming together. He had done a lot in his life, closed deals worth more than entire towns, but this felt different. The satisfaction wasn't about numbers, about stock prices rising, about assets gained. It was something deeper, something he hadn't realized he was missing. The boys arrived soon after, their bikes skidding to a stop as they took in the sight before them. Ethan let out a low whistle, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets as he nodded approvingly. "Damn, you actually pulled it off." Chris smirked. "Told you I don't make empty promises." Tony grinned, nudging Peter. "Think it's safe to say this place looks a little better than before." Peter laughed. "Just a little." Karen came out of the center, clipboard in hand, giving Chris an exhausted but triumphant smile. "Everything's set up. We're expecting a big turnout." Chris nodded, taking in the growing crowd. Parents arriving with their kids, volunteers handing out refreshments, local musicians setting up near the entrance to play for the event. It was more than just a ribbon-cutting ceremony. It was a celebration, a new beginning. At exactly noon, Karen stepped forward, tapping the microphone they had set up at the front steps. The crowd quieted. She looked out at the people gathered, clearing her throat before speaking. "I don't think I need to tell any of you what this place has meant to our town," she began, her voice carrying through the open space. "For years, it's been a safe haven, a place for kids to come after school, a place where people could find support, where friendships were built. But we also know it was falling apart, and for a long time we thought there was nothing we could do about it." She turned to Chris, and the crowd followed her gaze. He felt their eyes on him, but for once, he wasn't thinking about image, about perception. He was just standing there, a part of something much bigger than himself. "But then someone came along who saw the value in what we had," Karen continued. "Someone who didn't just throw money at a problem and walk away. Someone who stood beside us, who put in the work, who believed that this place mattered just as much as we did." She motioned for Chris to step forward. He hadn't planned to speak, but as the applause started, as the voices of gratitude swelled around him, he realized he had something to say. He took the microphone, the applause settling into an expectant silence. "I won't stand up here and pretend I'm some kind of hero," he said, his voice steady. "I didn't come here planning to do any of this. In fact, when I first drove through this town, I wasn't thinking about anything but myself. My career, my money, my time." He glanced at Ethan, Tony, and Peter, standing near the front of the crowd, their expressions unreadable. "But then I met 3 kids who showed me something I wasn't expecting," he continued. "They reminded me that not everything in life is a transaction, that doing something good doesn't have to come with a price tag. They helped me when they didn't have to, and that made me realize I had the ability to do the same." He looked out at the people before him, at the families who would benefit from this center for years to come. "This place belongs to you," he said simply, "and I hope it continues to be something you're proud of." The crowd erupted into cheers, and Chris stepped back, handing the microphone back to Karen. The ribbon was cut, and just like that, the center was officially reopened. Kids ran through the doors, exploring the new classrooms, racing to be the first on the swings and slides. Parents exchanged smiles, shaking hands with volunteers, already talking about the programs that could be launched. Chris stood at a distance, watching it all unfold. Ethan approached, arms crossed, his usual smirk playing on his lips. "Didn't think you had a speech in you, mister." Chris chuckled. "Neither did I." Tony nudged Peter. "Guess we should start thinking about what we're fixin' next." Peter laughed. "Yeah, what's next, Mr. Billionaire?" Chris thought about it. He could have easily said this was it, that he had done what he came to do. But deep down he knew the truth. He wasn't finished. Not yet. "Let's find out," he said. The boys grinned, and for the first time in a long time, Chris wasn't thinking about boardrooms or balance sheets. He wasn't thinking about deals or deadlines. He was thinking about something real, something that actually mattered. And he knew without a doubt that this was only the beginning. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can lead to the biggest changes. This billionaire thought he had everything, but in the end, it was 3 teenagers who showed him what truly mattered. What do you think about this story? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an inspiring story like this. See you in the next video.